The Valiant drifted silently through the dark expanse of space, its hull reflecting the cold light of distant stars. The crew, a hand-picked team of explorers, scientists, and soldiers, had been on a routine scouting mission for nearly 2 years. They had mapped dozens of uncharted worlds, catalogued countless celestial anomalies, but none had prepared them for what they were about to find. Captain Rachel Razor Adams stood at the bridge, her hands clasped behind her back, eyes scanning the holographic readouts before her. The planet ahead was unremarkable by all standards. No known life, no significant resources, just another rocky world at the edge of the galaxy. But something about the way it seemed to pulse in the infrared spectrum caught their attention. A faint anomaly, barely noticeable, yet undeniable. "Captain," said Lieutenant Marcus Gray, the ship's lead sensor specialist, his voice a mix of excitement and concern, "we've picked up a strange energy signature coming from the planet's surface. It's unlike anything we've seen before. It's almost ancient." Adams frowned. "What do you mean by ancient?" "I can't explain it, ma'am. The energy readings are fluctuating, but they're consistent. It almost feels like a beacon, a signal from deep space, yet it's coming from this planet. Whatever it is, it's been here a long time." Gray's hands danced across his console, his brow furrowed. "We're a long way from any major shipping lanes," Adams muttered. "Could it be a trap?" Gray shook his head. No sign of any military-grade tech. Just strange. Adams exchanged a glance with her first officer, Commander Liet Nakamura, who gave her a curt nod. "Plot a course. Let's see what's down there. Keep it quiet. No broadcast. No transmissions. We don't know who else might be listening." Minutes later, the Valiant descended into the atmosphere of the planet, its massive engines humming softly as they sliced through the thick clouds. The planet's surface was a desolate wasteland, littered with jagged rocks and the remnants of an ancient civilization. Massive stone pillars, half buried in sand, loomed in the distance, their weathered surfaces bearing strange, unrecognizable symbols. The entire landscape exuded an eerie stillness, as if the planet itself was holding its breath. "We're here," Adams said. "Land at the coordinates. Let's keep it tight and make it fast." The shuttle descended swiftly and landed with a soft thud on the dusty ground. The crew disembarked, armed and ready for whatever they might encounter. As they moved through the ruins, the sense of age and abandonment was overwhelming. It was clear that this place had been untouched for millennia. Yet the energy signal was growing stronger, emanating from deep beneath the surface. They finally reached a large stone structure, partially collapsed, but still towering above them. A giant doorway loomed before them, its surface adorned with intricate carvings and alien script. It seemed to beckon them forward. The signal was coming from within. "Captain, I don't know what we're walking into," Nakamura said, her voice tense. Adams didn't respond at first. She reached out and pressed a button on her wrist, activating her communicator. "This is Captain Adams. Secure the perimeter. No one comes in until we're back." With a nod, she motioned for her team to follow her inside. The air was stale, the walls covered in strange symbols that shimmered faintly, as if alive. The further they descended, the more oppressive the feeling became. There was something unnatural about the silence, an absence of life that felt almost intentional. As they reached the bottom of the ancient stairwell, they came upon a massive chamber, its walls lined with massive columns that seemed to pulse with the same strange energy they had detected from orbit. At the center of the room lay the artifact, shrouded in an unnatural glow, hovering inches above a pedestal. It was a cube, impossibly smooth, its surface reflecting light in a way that made it seem almost fluid, as if it were not quite a physical object, but something more. The moment they stepped closer, the air in the room seemed to change. The walls shimmered, and the ground beneath their feet vibrated with a low hum. The artifact was reacting to them, awakening from its long slumber. Suddenly, an alarm blared. The hum grew louder, and the chamber's stone walls began to shift, moving like liquid. The team spun around, their weapons drawn, but no one saw the threat. The ground beneath their feet cracked open, and out of the darkness came a shape, large, mechanical, and ominously silent. They had triggered something far worse than they could have imagined. The artifact wasn't just a relic. It was a warning, and it had been waiting for the right moment to be found. The mechanical shape emerged from the darkness like a nightmare made flesh. It was massive, easily the size of a small warship, and its limbs moved with a precision that betrayed its purpose. It was designed to destroy. A series of glowing red eyes flickered to life across its form, illuminating the chamber in an eerie, pulsating glow. The thing's body was a hybrid of organic and mechanical components, as though it had been born from the ruins of this planet, but enhanced with technology far beyond anything humanity had encountered. "Captain, what the hell is that?" Lieutenant Gray's voice crackled through the communicator, laced with panic. Adams's eyes narrowed, calculating. "We don't have the luxury of questioning it, Lieutenant. Open fire." The crew responded instantly, weapons raised as they unleashed volleys of fire at the mechanical beast. The energy bolts bounced harmlessly off its armored hide, leaving only faint scorch marks. The creature's eyes glowed brighter, and then, without warning, it lunged, its movements lightning fast for something of its size. "Move!" shouted Commander Nakamura, pushing Adams out of the way as the creature's massive claw swiped through the space where she had just been standing. Sparks flew from the walls as the claw collided with the stone, sending chunks of debris flying. The team scattered, sprinting in different directions as the mechanical monstrosity swiped again, its claws tearing through the air with a deafening screech. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the creature advanced, its steps shaking the very foundations of the chamber. Adams barely avoided another blow, her breath sharp and fast as her hand gripped her blaster, searching for a weak point in the creature's thick plating. "It's not human, that's for sure," Nakamura shouted from behind a pillar, firing a steady stream of shots that seemed to have little effect. Adams's mind raced. The only way they were going to survive this was to outthink it. The creature was obviously a guardian, designed to protect the artifact at all costs. But why now? Why after thousands of years? The answers were slipping further away as the thing advanced on them, each of its steps sending waves of pressure through the air. "We need to get back to the Valiant," Adams shouted, hoping the distress beacon they'd sent earlier had been received. "Fall back." But just as she turned to lead her team toward the exit, the chamber doors slammed shut with a deafening clang. The walls rumbled, and the ceiling overhead began to shift. The creature wasn't alone. From the dark corners of the chamber, more of them appeared, smaller, but no less deadly. They had been waiting. A shot rang out, followed by a scream. "Gray!" Nakamura's voice cracked as she whirled around to see the lieutenant struggling to move, his leg pinned beneath the weight of one of the smaller mechanical beasts. Its sharp claws dug into the floor, pushing down with relentless force. "Get him out of there," Adams ordered. But as Nakamura moved to help, the creature reached out, blocking her path with a swipe of its tail. It slammed her into the stone wall, her body crumpling to the ground with a sickening thud. Adams gritted her teeth. They were outmatched, outgunned, and now the clock was ticking. "Captain." Gray's voice rang out weakly from behind her. She turned, her eyes wild as she calculated their options. There weren't many left. The creature that had pinned Gray lifted its claws, preparing to finish him off. Adams acted on instinct, diving forward and firing at the beast with all her might. The energy blast hit one of its eyes, causing a cascade of sparks to erupt from its face. The creature reeled back, screeching in agony, but it didn't fall. It shifted its focus to her. "Move! Now!" She barked at the rest of the team. They could hear the hum of more enemies entering the chamber. There was no way they could hold out much longer. Nakamura was the first to recover, drawing her knife from her belt and charging toward the creature that had attacked Gray. With a practiced move, she jammed the blade into the creature's underbelly, cutting through metal with impressive precision. The beast screeched in pain and staggered backward. Adams didn't wait for the victory. "Get him up, now!" She shouted again, and Nakamura scrambled to her feet, pulling Gray to safety as Adams kept the creatures at bay, her shots landing with deadly accuracy. The team moved quickly, ducking and weaving through the labyrinthine halls of the ancient structure, with the metallic monsters hot on their trail. The air felt thick with the weight of history. This was no ordinary ruin. The artifact had awakened something far older, far deadlier than they could have ever expected. They reached the exit to the surface, but just as they were about to make their escape, a sudden explosion rocked the chamber behind them. The ground split open, and the once secure exit was sealed off by a massive rock slide. "We're trapped," Nakamura hissed, but Adams's voice was calm, even as the gravity of the situation pressed down on them. "No, we're not. We fight." But with every second they lingered, more of the creatures closed in. The battle was far from over. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the rocks and debris cascaded around them. Adams's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't let fear take hold. Not now. Not when there was so much at stake. "Fall back to the shuttle," she barked, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Now." The team scrambled toward the exit, weapons ready. Gray limped alongside Nakamura, but his face was pale, the wound in his leg slowing him down. He gritted his teeth, refusing to fall behind. Adams took up the rear, her pulse rifle raised, her eyes constantly scanning for any signs of movement. The mechanical creatures were relentless, and they were closing in fast. As they reached the shuttle's landing pad, the sound of heavy footfalls echoed in the distance, followed by a guttural roar. The first wave of creatures had broken through the debris. Adams's fingers flew over her wrist console, attempting to signal the Valiant. Come on," she muttered under her breath, frustration mounting. The signal was being jammed. The enemy was cutting them off from reinforcements. "Captain, we can't hold them off forever," Nakamura said, her voice tight with urgency. "We need to get airborne now." Adams's eyes darted to the sky above them. The Valiant was still in orbit, but if the jamming interference continued, they would be on their own. And if those creatures got to the ship first, they'd never make it back. The shuttle's engines roared to life, and Adams barked orders into the comms. "Get us into the air, now," she demanded. The shuttle lifted off, its thrusters blasting away the dust and debris as they soared into the sky. But just as they cleared the atmosphere, a new signal erupted on the scanner, something massive, moving fast, something they hadn't seen before. "Captain," Gray's voice crackled through the comms, shaky but insistent. "Something's coming up from the surface. It's big." The shuttle's autopilot system began to alert them of an incoming threat. Adams squinted out the viewport, her jaw tightening as a massive shape rose from the planet below. It was no creature they had encountered so far, but rather a colossal warship, a hulking structure made of the same strange metallic material that the Guardians were composed of. It seemed to rise from the planet's core like a living organism, its surface gleaming with strange symbols, and at its heart, what looked like a massive energy core that pulsed with a dark, foreboding glow. "All hands, brace for impact," Adams ordered, slamming into the pilot's seat to take control of the shuttle's systems. She wasn't about to let whatever that was destroy everything they'd just fought for. But the ship didn't attack immediately. Instead, it seemed to call to them. A deep, resonant hum reverberated through the shuttle's metal hull. It was unlike anything Adams had ever heard, more than just sound. It was an influence, like a force pressing against her very mind. "What the hell is that?" Nakamura asked, her voice shaken. Adams's eyes narrowed as she searched the scanner, analyzing the strange energy readings. She couldn't shake the feeling that they had just stumbled upon something far more important than they could have anticipated. This wasn't just a relic. It was a weapon, yes, but it was also a key, and this ship was its guardian. The artifact, Adams muttered to herself. It's calling it. She turned to the crew, her mind racing. The Kalthar, their most immediate enemies, had been searching for the artifact for centuries. The signals they had picked up earlier weren't the only ones. The ship they had just discovered was more than a threat. It was a conduit to something greater, something that the entire galaxy had long forgotten. Gray, still limping, raised his head, his face grim. "You're saying this thing. It's tied to the artifact." "Yes," Adams said, her voice steady. "But we need to figure out exactly what it is, and fast. If that ship is anything like the Guardians below, it won't hesitate to kill us all." The shuttle rocked as a bolt of energy shot past them, narrowly missing the tail. The warship wasn't waiting any longer. "We're not just dealing with relic hunters," Adams said, her tone sharp. "We've just opened Pandora's box, and now the galaxy is going to pay for it. We need to get back to the Valiant, warn the fleet, and figure out how to control this thing, or destroy it before it destroys us." But as the Valiant appeared on the horizon, a distant glimmer of hope in an otherwise darkened sky, something else happened. The warship's energy pulse flared brighter, and then, all at once, the very fabric of space around them warped, as if the ship had breached a tier in reality itself. "Get us out of here," Adams shouted, slamming the controls. But the damage had already been done. The energy ripple reached them faster than they could react, and before Adams could give another order, everything went dark. Adams awoke to a searing pain in her head, the world spinning as she struggled to clear her vision. The shuttle had barely managed to escape the warship's gravitational pull before everything went black, but now she was lying on the floor of the Valiant's med bay, the sterile scent of antiseptic filling her nostrils. Her hand instinctively went to her head, feeling the bandages where a deep gash had been treated. "Captain," Nakamura's voice broke through the haze. "Are you all right?" Adams groaned as she pushed herself into a sitting position. Her thoughts were sluggish, but she forced her mind to focus. The ship had made it back to orbit. Barely, and now they were safe, but not for long. The Valiant was damaged, and the artifact's signal was growing more intense, more urgent. The Kalthar were out there, and the galaxy had just been put on notice. "I'm fine," Adams said, her voice rough. "Where are we?" Nakamura hesitated, her eyes flicking to the doorway where Gray stood, his face pale and drawn. "We're in orbit above the planet. We've been here for hours. But we've got a bigger problem than just the warship. Adams's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? Nakamura gestured to the screen above the maid-bay bed. On it, a live feed of the Valiant's command deck flashed. There, on the main screen, was the unmistakable insignia of the Calthar, and beside it, a message, a demand. They've sent us a warning, Nakamura continued. They want the artifact. No negotiation. Adams stood up, her body aching but her resolve clear. And what did we say? We said no, but they're not backing down. If we don't comply, they'll take the ship, and the artifact, by force. Adams clenched her fists. The Calthar had been relentless in their pursuit of the artifact, but this was more than a military standoff. They were playing for keeps, and humanity was caught right in the middle. Suddenly, the door to the mead bay slid open, and Grey entered, his face grave. "Captain, we've intercepted communications from within the fleet," he said, his voice shaking. "There's been a breach." Adams's heart skipped a beat. A breach? How? "We don't know yet," Grey replied. "But we've identified the source. It's one of our own." The weight of his words hit her like a punch to the gut. A traitor inside the fleet. The betrayal was swift, cold, and calculated. Whoever had infiltrated their ranks was working with the Calthar, and that meant humanity's last line of defense had just been compromised. "Who?" Adams demanded, her voice low and dangerous. "We're still tracing it," Grey said. "But the communications were routed through the senior officer's channels. It's someone high up." A sense of dread settled over Adams like a cloak. "We need to find them fast." But before Grey could respond, the ship's alarms began to blare. The lights flickered, and a voice echoed over the loudspeaker, smooth and calm, but chilling in its delivery. "This is Admiral Corps of the Calthar fleet. Surrender the artifact immediately. You have 1 hour to comply, or we will take it by force." Adams felt the cold weight of the situation pressing down on her chest. An hour. They had 1 hour to figure out who the traitor was, prevent the Calthar from getting what they wanted, and escape with the artifact. The stakes had never been higher. "We don't have time," Nakamura said, her voice urgent. "We need to act now." Adams nodded. "Grey, run a full diagnostic of the ship's systems. We need to know if we've been compromised internally." "On it," Grey replied, already moving to the console. Adams turned to Nakamura, her face hardening. "You and I will go to the command deck. We need to take control of the situation before it's too late." But as she began to move, a sudden realization hit her like a freight train. What if the traitor has already sabotaged the ship? Adams said quietly. What if they've already made their move? Nakamura's face darkened. "Then we'll deal with them." Adams and Nakamura hurried to the command deck, their boots clanging against the metal floors. As they entered, the tension was palpable. The senior officers and crew were all at their stations, but there was an undeniable shift in the air. Something wasn't right. Every glance exchanged between them felt heavy, laden with unspoken questions. "Adams, Commander Holt, the Valiant's chief engineer," said as they approached. "We've got a problem. The main reactor is offline. Someone's tampered with the core." Adams froze. "Who?" Holt swallowed. "I'm not sure, but the sabotage was deliberate." Adams's heart sank. There was no time for second guesses. "Find out who did this," she said, her voice cold. "And lock them in the brig." Holt nodded and immediately got to work, but Adams's eyes were scanning the crew around her. Every one of them was a potential suspect. And as the minutes ticked away, She felt the gnawing suspicion in the back of her mind. Could it be someone she trusted? Could it be someone who had been with her from the beginning? Nakamura leaned in close, her voice low. "Captain, we can't waste time. The Kalthar are closing in." Adams's lips pressed into a thin line. "I know, and we'll fight. But first, we need to root out the traitor. Whoever it is, they've made their choice. And now they'll pay." As the crew worked feverishly to try and restore the Valiant, Adams's mind raced. She had to find the traitor. And she had to do it before the Kalthar descended upon them. With only minutes left, a deadly game of trust and betrayal had begun. And this time, there would be no second chances. The tension in the command deck was suffocating. The crew worked feverishly, fingers flying across consoles as they tried to restore the Valiant's systems. But the sabotage had gone deeper than Adams could have anticipated. The main reactor was still offline, and with every passing second, the Kalthar warship moved closer. Adams paced back and forth, her thoughts a blur of strategy and suspicion. She had to find the traitor, and she had to find them fast. The seconds were ticking away, and soon the Kalthar would be upon them. "Status report," Adams barked, her eyes locking onto the senior officers in the room. Commander Nakamura, who had been coordinating the tactical efforts, looked up from her console. "The reactor's still not responding. Holt is having trouble bypassing the damage, and we're running out of time. I don't know how much longer we can keep them out." Adams's eyes flickered to the display, where the image of the approaching Kalthar warship loomed larger by the minute. The enemy was relentless. They knew the artifact was aboard the Valiant, and they weren't going to let it slip through their fingers. "We need to prepare for a possible boarding action," Nakamura said, her voice tight with urgency. "If they reach us before we can move, they'll overrun us in minutes." Adams clenched her jaw. That's not going to happen. But as she spoke, the door to the command deck slid open, and Lieutenant Grey entered, looking more strained than ever. His face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead, but his eyes were sharp. "Captain," he said, walking briskly toward her, "I've finished analyzing the communications logs, and I think I found something." Adams's gaze hardened. "What do you have?" Grey paused, taking a breath. "It's subtle, but there's a pattern. Someone's been leaking data about our movements and the artifact to the Kalthar. At first, it seemed random, just normal communications. But then I noticed something strange. The leaks were all routed through our senior officer channels." Adams's heart skipped a beat. "Who?" Grey hesitated, then grimly pulled up a series of encrypted logs on the main screen. The display flashed with names and timestamps. "It's someone close to you, Captain. The communications were sent through Commander Holt's terminal." Adams froze, her blood running cold. Holt, her trusted chief engineer, had been with her since the Valiant was first commissioned. He had been her right hand through every battle, every crisis. The thought that he could be the traitor was almost unbearable. Nakamura's voice was low, barely above a whisper. "Captain, we need to confront him." Adams's mind raced. There had to be a mistake. Holt was loyal. He had to be. But the evidence was undeniable. "No," Adams said sharply. "We need to be sure. We can't make a move without solid proof." Grey stepped closer, his voice urgent. "We don't have time for that, Captain. The Kalthar are on their way. If Holt is the one responsible, we need to act before he sabotages us further." Adams's eyes narrowed. "Then we'll have to find a way to neutralize the threat without tipping him off. I'm not putting the crew at risk by making a rash move." Grey nodded reluctantly, then turned toward the comms panel. I'll start tracing the rest of the communications. Maybe there's more we can uncover about Holt's involvement. Adams's mind was already working through a plan, but the stakes were too high to let emotions cloud her judgment. Holt's betrayal, or any betrayal, could spell the end for humanity. But she had to be certain. One wrong move, and the traitor could tear the Valiant apart from the inside. She turned back to Nakamura. We can't let Holt know we're on to him. If he's the traitor, he's already set his plan into motion. We need to move quickly. I'll confront him myself. Nakamura's eyes darkened. Are you sure about this, Captain? If he is the traitor, he could have backup. We could be walking into a trap. Adams hesitated. The risk was enormous, but if Holt was the traitor, she knew she couldn't afford to wait any longer. We don't have a choice, she said, her voice steady. Get the crew ready for a potential boarding action. If the Calthar come before we're ready, we'll fight. But first, we need to deal with the traitor. The silence that followed was deafening. Every officer on the deck knew the gravity of the situation. There was no room for doubt. The galaxy's future depended on their next move. Adams made her way to the engineering deck, her pulse quickening with every step. She had trained for moments like this. Moments of decision, moments of betrayal, but the cold, empty feeling in her stomach was something she couldn't ignore. She was walking into the lion's den. As the door to engineering opened, she was greeted by the soft hum of the Valiant's systems, the steady rhythm of life aboard the ship. Holt was at his console, his back to her, absorbed in his work. The tension in the room was suffocating. Holt, Adams said, her voice like steel. He turned slowly, a calm smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes. Captain, he said, his tone almost too smooth. I trust everything is going well. Adams didn't hesitate. She locked eyes with him. I know what you've done. Holt's smile faltered, but only for a fraction of a second. You've made a grave mistake, Adams said quietly. And then in the tense silence that followed, she saw it. The flicker of guilt. It was small, but it was there. The air in the engineering deck felt thick with tension, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Holt stood perfectly still, his gaze unwavering, but there was something in his eyes, something colder than Adams had ever seen. For a moment, neither of them spoke, as if testing the waters, waiting for the other to make the first move. Adams's hand instinctively tightened around the pulse rifle at her side. She didn't want to have to use it, but if Holt truly was the traitor, she had no choice. The fate of the entire fleet, of humanity itself, was at stake. I don't know what you think you found, Captain, Holt said, his voice smooth, almost too calm. But you're mistaken. I'm loyal to the Valiant. Always have been. Adams's jaw tightened. You've been leaking our movements to the Calthar. You've sabotaged our reactor. You're working with them, Holt. He chuckled softly, the sound devoid of any real humor. You think you can stop me? I'd already won. Adams's blood ran cold. What do you mean? Holt's smile grew, the glimmer of malice evident in his eyes. The artifact isn't just a weapon. It's a key, a doorway to something much more powerful than anything your precious fleet could ever comprehend. The Calthar know that, and I've made sure they'll get it. And once they do, well, you can kiss your little resistance goodbye. Adams's heart hammered in her chest. The betrayal was deeper than she had imagined. Holt hadn't just been selling them out. He was a part of something far bigger, something that could shift the balance of power in the galaxy. If the Calthar got their hands on the artifact, the entire galaxy would fall. You've been playing both sides, Adams said, her voice icy. You've been working with them from the start. Holt shrugged. It's simple logic. The Calthar are unstoppable. I chose the winning side, and now the galaxy will bow to them. Adams's mind raced. Holt's betrayal wasn't just a tactical error. It was a betrayal of everything humanity stood for. But there was something else she had to know. How much had he really compromised? Was the Valiant even capable of fighting the Calthar now that their reactor had been sabotaged? "You're sure the Calthar will come for us?" she pressed, her voice low. "That warship, they won't just attack. They'll destroy us, won't they?" Holt's eyes flickered with a brief, almost imperceptible hesitation. It was enough for Adams to see the truth. He wasn't as sure of his victory as he pretended to be. That uncertainty was his weakness. "They won't destroy us," Holt said, his voice tinged with something less certain than before. "Not yet, but they will extract the artifact." And then a loud alarm suddenly blared, cutting him off. The entire deck trembled as the ship's internal systems began to fail. "What the hell?" Adams muttered, looking up at the flickering lights above them. "Captain," a voice came over the comms, urgent and panicked. "We've lost control of the main reactor. It's starting to destabilize. If we don't get it back online in the next 10 minutes, we'll be sitting ducks." Adams's heart skipped a beat. Holt had done more than just betray them. He had ensured the Valiant was on the brink of destruction. If the reactor went critical, the ship would be vaporized before they could even make a run for it. "You've doomed us all," she said quietly, her voice filled with disbelief. Holt's expression remained unchanged, but there was an edge of desperation creeping into his tone. "You think I don't know that? The Valiant is nothing now. We're already dead. You just don't know it yet." Adams's mind raced. There had to be a way out. The Calthar warship was still out there, closing in, and the Valiant was on the verge of collapse. But one thing was clear. Holt was desperate. He might have thought he'd already won, but something was cracking in his facade. "Listen to me, Holt," Adams said, her voice low and steady. "You're not just fighting for the Calthar. You're fighting for something much bigger. You're fighting for your own survival." Holt's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" Adams took a step closer, her gaze piercing. "If the Calthar get their hands on the artifact, they won't just use it against humanity. They'll use it against everyone, including you. The power it holds isn't meant to be controlled. It's a weapon, yes, but it's also a trap. It'll consume whoever tries to wield it." For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Holt's face. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there, and in that moment, Adams knew she had found the crack in his resolve. "Think about it, Holt," Adams said, her voice sharp. "You've been played just like the rest of us. The Calthar don't care about loyalty. They only care about power. If they get the artifact, you'll be nothing but a pawn, just like they've turned us all into pawns." Holt's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. "You don't understand. The Calthar." "The Calthar won't stop," Adams interrupted, her voice fierce. "And neither will I, but I can still stop you." Without warning, she lunged forward, grabbing Holt by the collar and slamming him against the nearest wall. His breath came in sharp gasps as his eyes locked with hers, and for a moment, Adams could see the full weight of his fear. "You're not the only one with something to lose," she growled. "Now tell me how to fix the reactor, or this ship won't survive long enough for you to see your victory." Holt's gaze flickered to the console beside him, his defiance crumbling just enough for Adams to see the cracks. With a deep, defeated sigh, he finally spoke. "It's not completely destroyed. You have a chance. but it won't be easy. Then tell me, Adams demanded, her voice unwavering. No. The seconds ticked by as Holt reluctantly gave the coordinates for a manual override. But just as Adams turned toward the console, the ship's systems blared again, this time with a far more insistent warning. The Calfar were almost here, and the countdown to humanity's last stand had already begun. The seconds felt like hours as Adams rushed to the control console. She could feel the Valiant shuddering beneath her feet, the ship's failing systems groaning in protest. The reactor was on the brink of total meltdown. Holt had given them a sliver of hope, a manual override that could potentially stabilize the core, but every movement felt like a race against time. 10 minutes. The voice of Lieutenant Gray crackled over the comms. We've got less than 10 minutes before the reactor goes critical. You need to move faster, Captain. Adams didn't need the reminder. Her hands flew over the console's interface, fingers typing furiously as she accessed the reactor's control systems. The screen blinked with a series of errors, codes she didn't recognize, warnings flashing in every direction. But she had no time for hesitation. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. Holt, she barked. You better be telling the truth. If I die because of a trick, I'll make sure the Calthar know your name. Holt stood silently, his expression dark but unreadable. He had no response, only the deep guilt of a man who had sold out his crew, his people, and his future. The ship's alarms blared louder now, a constant reminder of the impending doom. Adams was no longer just racing against the Calthar fleet. She was racing against the end of the Valiant itself. Nakamura's voice came over the comms, urgent. Captain, the Calthar warship has locked onto our position. They're preparing to fire. If you don't get us moving, we're going to be obliterated before the reactor stabilizes. Adams's blood ran cold. How long until they fire? 5 minutes. Adams's mind raced. They had 5 minutes to fix the reactor, get the ship back online, and get the hell out of range. It was impossible, but they didn't have the luxury of time. The Calthar were relentless, and Holt's betrayal had ensured that every move they made was under scrutiny. Gray, she said, her voice sharp. Prepare all weapon systems. I don't care if we have to make a suicidal charge. We are not going down without a fight. Understood, Gray replied immediately, his tone resolute. We'll have the defenses online in 3 minutes. Adams turned back to Holt, who was watching her with that same distant expression, his eyes darkened with remorse. But there was something else there now, a flicker of fear. She could see it clearly now, the realization that things were spiraling out of his control. You're still one of us, Holt, Adams said, her voice softer but firm. Help me fix this. You can't undo what you've done, but you can save the crew. Help me stop the Calthar. For the first time since their confrontation began, Holt hesitated. His lips parted, but he said nothing for a moment, his mind seemingly torn between loyalty to his traitorous cause and the reality of the situation unfolding around them. Finally, he exhaled a sharp breath. It's not just the reactor, he said, his voice shaking. If the Calthar want the artifact, they'll do whatever it takes to get it, even if it means destroying us all first. Adams's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? Holt looked around the room, his voice dropping to a whisper. The artifact, it's tied to the ship's core systems. It's not just an object of power. It's integrated into the ship's design, into the very fabric of our technology. If the Calthar fire on us, they'll trigger a cascade effect that will make the reactor meltdown look like a child's game. Adams's stomach churned. You're saying that if we go down, The artifact will make sure we take everyone with us. Holt nodded grimly. I didn't realize it at first, but when I made the deal with the Calthar, they told me they would use the artifact to control the Valiant, and anyone who had it. They're not just after the artifact. They want to make sure we can't use it against them. A deep chill settled over Adams's chest. The stakes had just risen to an unimaginable level. The artifact wasn't just a key to power. It was the key to their destruction, a ticking time bomb that could tear through everything in its wake. If the Calthar took it, they would have the ultimate weapon, one capable of devastating entire fleets, entire worlds. I can stop it, Holt said quickly, his voice frantic. I can disable the connection between the artifact and the ship. But it's risky. We'll have to separate the artifact from the core systems, and I'll need to bypass several failsafes. If I screw up, we're all dead. Adams didn't hesitate. Do it. Holt's hands flew to the console, working with a speed that bordered on desperation. Adams watched him, calculating every move, every possible outcome. If he was lying, there was no second chance. But Holt was out of options. He knew it as much as she did. Captain, Gray's voice crackled over the comms again. The Calthar are preparing to fire in 2 minutes. You need to move fast. Get the shields up now, Adams ordered, her voice tight. We have one shot at this. The lights in the command deck flickered once again, and Holt's fingers were a blur over the console. The seconds stretched on, each one dragging like an eternity. Suddenly, the entire ship lurched, and a loud, resounding boom echoed through the hull. Brace. Adams shouted, holding on to the nearest console as the Valiant shuddered again. The ship was under attack. The Calthar had fired. But it wasn't the fatal blow Adams had feared. Holt had bought them just a few more seconds. We have a chance, Holt said through gritted teeth, sweat beading on his forehead. But we're not out of this yet. Adams's breath caught. Hurry, Holt. We don't have much time. As the countdown continued, she could only pray that Holt's gamble would pay off. The Calthar were closing in, and the reactor was still ticking. If they didn't move soon, the Valiant and everything aboard would be nothing but debris in the vast emptiness of space. 5 minutes. The ship's hull groaned as the Calthar warship's fire tore through the Valiant's weakened shields, shaking the entire structure. Sparks flew from the control panels, and the lights flickered violently. Adams gripped the edge of the command chair, her knuckles white, as she watched the damage reports flood the screens. They were running out of time. Shields are holding. Gray's voice came through the comms, but the urgency was evident. But they won't last long at this rate. We need to get the reactor online now. Adams's eyes snapped to Holt, who was hunched over the console, his hands moving in a blur as he worked feverishly to disconnect the artifact from the core systems. Sweat dripped from his forehead, and his face was pale with the effort. The seconds felt like hours. How much longer? Adams demanded, her voice sharp with impatience. Almost there, Holt grunted, his eyes locked on the readouts in front of him. Just need to bypass one last failsafe, then I can separate the artifact's interface from the ship's systems. But it's tricky. One wrong move, and we're done for. Adams's pulse raced. The Calthar were relentless, and with every passing second, they were closer to a catastrophic strike. She could feel the ship's damage piling up, but they couldn't afford to lose Holt now. They were on the edge of a precipice, and this was their only shot at survival. Captain, Nakamura's voice crackled over the comms. The Calthar are launching boarding pods. They're coming in hot. If we don't deal with them soon, We'll be fighting on two fronts. Understood, Adams said, our gaze hardening. Gray, prepare for a defensive stance. We can't afford to let them board us. Hold them off for as long as possible. On it, Gray replied immediately. Weapons systems are online. We'll buy you time. Adams turned back to Holt. His face was contorted with concentration, his fingers a blur over the console. Every muscle in Adams's body was tense, her thoughts a chaotic storm of strategy and desperation. They were so close, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Do it, Holt, she said through clenched teeth. Now. Holt looked up at her, eyes wide with determination. Almost. The ship shuddered violently again, and a loud explosion rocked the engineering deck. Sparks flew, and smoke poured from the console. Adams staggered forward, grabbing Holt by the arm. We don't have time, she shouted, her voice filled with urgency. They're here. Holt hesitated for a split second, his eyes locking with hers. Then, with a final, desperate push, he hit a series of buttons on the console. A loud, mechanical whine filled the air, followed by a soft, almost imperceptible hum. The lights flickered, then stabilized. The reactor's status readout shifted from red to yellow, and the tension in Adams's chest eased slightly. We're live, Holt said, panting. For now. Good, Adams said, her voice cold. Now we fight. She turned toward the comms station. Nakamura, prepare for immediate engagement. We're going to need every gun we have. The ship's loudspeakers crackled to life as Nakamura's voice echoed across the deck. All hands, brace for battle. Defensive stations, now. Adams took a deep breath, scanning the readouts. The Calthar warship was still a threat, but the Valiant was no longer a sitting target. The reactor was stable for the moment, and the shields were holding. The next few minutes would be critical. If they didn't break the Calthar's attack now, they wouldn't survive long enough to escape. Holt stood by her side, his hands trembling from the strain of his work, but there was no time for rest. What's our next move? He asked, his voice strained. We make them regret underestimating us, Adams replied grimly. Sir, Gray said, his voice filled with resolve, all weapon systems are locked onto the Calthar warship. We're ready to return fire. Do it, Adams ordered. The Valiant shuddered once again, but this time it was the sound of retaliation. The ship's weapon systems roared to life, launching a volley of high-powered lasers and plasma bolts toward the approaching Calthar pods. The alien warship retaliated almost immediately, its own weapons lighting up the void of space. Adams gritted her teeth, watching the battle unfold on the tactical display. The Calthar were formidable, but the Valiant wasn't going down without a fight. Every shot they fired counted. Every moment was critical. Shields holding at 40%, Nakamura reported. We've disabled 2 of their boarding pods, but there are still more incoming. We're not giving up, Adams snapped, her eyes cold with determination. Continue to engage. If we can't stop them now, we'll lose the ship and the artifact. It's not an option. Understood, Nakamura said firmly. We're holding the line. Adams's mind raced. The Calthar warship was still a threat, and the boarding pods were relentless. But with the reactor stabilized and the weapons systems online, they had a fighting chance. Every move had to be calculated. Every strike had to land. Captain, Gray's voice came over the comms again. We've taken some hits, but the Calthar are retreating from our firing range. It looks like they're preparing for another strike, but we've got some breathing room. Adams allowed herself a brief moment of relief. They weren't out of the woods yet, But the tide had shifted. They had the artifact. They had the ship. And they had a crew willing to fight to the last. She turned to Holt, who was standing beside her, still panting from the strain of his earlier work. His face was pale, but there was something else in his eyes now, something that wasn't there before. "You did good, Holt," she said, her voice quieter than before. Holt's eyes flickered to hers, his expression conflicted, but he nodded once. "I did what I had to do. We all did." Adams looked back to the view screen, where the Calthar warship loomed ominously, its weapons primed and ready. She knew the final confrontation was still ahead. But now, with the reactor stabilized and the Valiant's weapons at full power, she was ready to see this through. The battle for humanity's future had just begun. "Get ready," Adams said, her voice resolute. "This is our fight. We're not going down without a victory."